So thank you all very much. Good afternoon. We're very pleased that you're able to join this Borders event. My name is Violeta Moreno-Lax. I'm Professor of Law here at Queen Mary University of London and the inaugural Director of the Centre. We're very pleased, as I said, to be hosting this event on the medical border, exemplifying Australia's extraterritorial asylum regime. And we are very pleased to be welcoming our visiting fellow, Dr. Sara Dehm, who will be developing this concept of the medical border to explore the operations and harms of certain state refuge externalisation policies that Australia has been mobilising in conjunction with Nauru and PNG. And together with Sara, who is a senior lecturer at the law faculty of the University of Technology in Sydney, we are very happy to welcome Dr. Monish Bhatia, who is an academic at the University of York at the Department of Sociology, where he researches in areas regarding race, migration, and state violence. So that is going to be making for a great discussion and contextualization of Sara's intervention. We also have Dr. Nicolette Busuttil, who is a lecturer in law at SOAS at the University of London. She specializes on refugees and migrants under international and EU law, with a particular focus on persons with disabilities, so that there is an element of medicalisation in her work that will also help to contextualize the discussion of Sara's intervention. We are going to proceed in the following way. Sara will be speaking for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to be hearing from Monish and Nicolette for another 15 minutes each or so. I'll be keeping the time, and I'm going to be sending little messages individually on the Zoom chat, so please do keep an eye. It's difficult to be chairing on a hybrid event, but hopefully we're going to make it work. Alternatively, Ellen Aldi, who is assistant coordinator alongside Nicolette Busuttil in the Border Centre, will be helping out with this task so as to keep everything in check. Just a word about the Centre for those who might not know it yet. We are the Borders Centre devoted to the interdisciplinary study of borders, migration and displacement. We are anchored or hosted at the Law School of Queen Mary University of London, where we launched our activities in 2022 to focus on the study and critique of bordering, ordering, and othering processes through law. Our inspiration is to offer an excellence hub for intellectual collaboration and the evaluation of the role of law in the making and unmaking of borders and their impact on global mobility and immobility situations. The idea is to connect scholars within and beyond Queen Mary Law School to harness existing inter- and multidisciplinary research into law, borders, and mobility, and hopefully to shape future policy and research agendas in response to global challenges pertaining to borders. So without further ado, I've just been told actually that we adjusted the timings. Sara has a bit longer. We're going to be hearing from Sara for 35 minutes and then passing on the floor to our commentators. For those joining online, please formulate your questions using the chat box on Zoom. We'll be keeping an eye on this. And we're also going to be keeping an eye on questions from participants who are joining us in person in London, and we will be alternating so that there is hopefully a good flow and a good complementarity between interventions from the Zoom chat and those in person from the room. So thank you all very much, and the floor is yours, Sara. As I said, I'm going to be keeping the time for you, but we're looking forward to hearing more about the medical border in Australia in relation to the extraterritorial asylum regime. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Violeta, and to Queen Mary and the Border Centre in particular, Violeta, Nicolette and Ellen, for your warm welcome and also for hosting my visit, and to Monish and Nicolette for acting as discussants today. So I think it's a sobering time to be talking about the operation and harms of Australia's extraterritorial asylum regime, given UK efforts in part to replicate aspects of the so-called Australian model. I also want to acknowledge that my university, UTS in Sydney, is located on unceded Gadigal lands. That carries particular responsibilities. And as I hope to gesture in the conclusion of my remarks today, I think it's vital that struggles for refugee and border justice in Australia and elsewhere centre both Pacific visions for a more just Oceania and recognition of First Nations sovereignty in Australia. It's impossible to speak about Australia's denial of decent healthcare to refugees at this moment without also recognising Israel's systematic destruction of medical infrastructure in Gaza over the last 6 months, in which around 500 Palestinian health workers have been killed and all major hospitals attacked or destroyed. Palestinians too are caught up in Australia's system of arbitrary and near indefinite detention, even though many are recognised as stateless, and even though a UK asylum judge recently held that a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship had a well-founded fear of persecution, in part on the basis that Israel is an apartheid state. This means that refugee justice in Australia is also intertwined with Palestinian freedom and liberation. So with that in mind, let me start with a story. So in June of 2018, a 2-year-old child living in the Pacific Island Republic of Nauru fell seriously ill. As she was born to refugee parents who Australia had forcibly transferred from Australia to closed immigration detention in Nauru some 5 years earlier, and who had since been recognised as refugees under Nauruan law, the young girl had spent her entire life living in Australian-funded housing in the Nauruan community, unable to leave the island and awaiting the then elusive resettlement options to materialise. As a result of this status, the girl's principal source of healthcare was a small basic medical clinic run by a private for-profit operator called the International Health and Medical Service, or IHMS. That was contracted and fully funded by the Australian government. The girl's parents brought her to this clinic where she was given paracetamol and sent home. 4 days later, with worsening symptoms, she returned to the clinic where she received IV fluids and was placed under observation. The following day, she was transferred to Nauru's only hospital, but ultimately returned to the IHMS clinic due to a bed shortage at the hospital. That same day, the IHMS staff consulted an emergency physician in Australia who advised that the girl's symptoms likely represented severe sepsis, and which carried a high mortality rate, and recommended urgent evacuation to a first world hospital. That was a quote. That afternoon, the IHMS nurse submitted a request to the Australian Border Force, seeking the girl's urgent evacuation to Australia or elsewhere with quote-unquote comparable medical standards. The Australian authorities, in response, asked whether medical transfer to Papua New Guinea or Taiwan would be options, given that Australia had concluded agreements with both states to enable such transfers as part of a deliberate strategy to prevent refugees from accessing Australian hospitals. Despite IHMS warning that the PNG hospital at the time may not have the necessary facilities, Australian Border Force nonetheless transferred the girl there. In light of further independent medical advice that the girl remained at risk of serious brain injury, her parents successfully instructed Australian lawyers to bring an urgent injunction in the Australian Federal Court, compelling the Australian government to transfer the child, along with her mother and eventually her father, to Australia for medical care. The child and her family have now been living in Australia for the last 5 years in a precarious cycle of temporary visas. In November last year, the Australian government entered into a confidential settlement with the young girl for an undisclosed sum of money in light of her possible long-term neurological impairment. So this case is unique in that it's the first settlement in relation to an alleged breach of Australia's possible legal duty to provide proper healthcare to refugees under Australia's extraterritorial asylum regime in Nauru and PNG. In approving the settlement, the Australian judge noted that the Australian government was not admitting any liability, including noting Australia's denial that it had assumed responsibility for her healthcare, nor that the medical treatment she had received was inadequate. And so whilst this is by no means the most extreme instance of medical neglect, I do think this case is illustrative of how medical care and harms have become enrolled in Australia's refugee deterrence, expulsion and externalisation practices, or indeed in the violence of state border regimes more generally. To date, 21 people have died under Australia's extraterritorial regime, including as a result of recognised medical neglect or by suicide, and hundreds more refugees have suffered or continue to suffer from chronic injuries. In one such case, an Australian coroner found that an Iranian refugee, Hamid Karzai, died as a direct result of quote-unquote systemic failures in healthcare provision to refugees in PNG, including a lack of antibiotics at the IHMS detention clinic, the failure of medical staff to properly diagnose his clinical deterioration, and a series of practical and operational matters, such as his delayed medical evacuation to Australia. So my current research is interested in how healthcare has come to function as a form and practice of border control in the Australian context. That is, how such practices enact what we might term medical borders, a concept that draws our attention to the place of medical infrastructure, expertise, rationalities and techniques within what Martina Tazzioli has called the confinement continuum of contemporary state borders. Indeed, the uses and effects of such medical expertise, actors and knowledge has been ambivalent and contested in the Australian context, both implicated in maintaining the infrastructure of offshore detention and also to delegitimise and transform its configuration and ends to some success. So in today's seminar, I'll briefly introduce the concept of medical borders. Then I'll provide an account of the systemic denial of decent healthcare in the Australian context, before analysing a sample of around 65 so-called Medivac negligence court cases initiated by refugee litigants with the support of Australian lawyers and doctors between 2016 and 2019 to evidence this contested medicalisation of asylum in the Australian context. I hope to show how legal processes, especially the demand for medical evidence to attest to the truth of refugee claims and suffering, and legal doctrines, particularly around standard of care arguments, have become key sites for advancing and challenging projects of border control, migrant oppression, and racialised exclusion. And while these cases do provide records of refugee claim-making, resistance and refusal, and need to be situated in broader refugee justice campaigns, they also point to the limits of providing refugee health justice within existing border infrastructures of confinement, deterrence and externalisation. Okay, so to the concept of the medical border. So given the diffuse, ubiquitous and multi-sided nature of contemporary state bordering practices, I think the concept of the medical border helps to isolate, connect and make visible a particular kind of border assemblage that enrolls medical infrastructure, healthcare professionals, medical forms of knowledge and expertise into the operation and ends of state border control, including in state projects for policing, restricting, surveilling or excluding certain racialised populations and border crossers. Such medical border assemblages are of course not new, and there's a rich scholarly literature that shows how medicine has long embedded histories within racist immigration laws and restrictions. So in Imperial Hygiene, Alison Bashford demonstrates how public health controls at colonial borders from the late 19th century shaped racialised ideas of the quote-unquote undesirable migrant. And similarly, in Fevered Measures, John McKiernan Gonzalez deploys the concept of the medical border to show how public health officials in the Texas-Mexico borderlands were key agents in distinguishing between different racialised populations, at times exercising, and I quote, often unchallenged public authority over the intimate boundaries of private life, and using medicine to determine who could move freely and who could be included or excluded in the nation. So medical border assemblages then locate authority in what Foucault has called the medical gaze, and seek to position health officials, in Miriam Picton's words, as de facto willing or unwilling border guards, as gatekeepers for imagined ideas of nation states. And hospitals, for example, have become key sites for immigration surveillance and enforcement, or the creation of knowledge about border crossers. States like Australia require hospitals to verify a person's immigration status before offering care, or in the US context, are even engaged in acts of so-called medical deportation. This means, as Meredith Van Natter has recently written, healthcare professionals bound by professional codes of ethics must, and I quote, often walk a fine line between enacting anti-immigrant practices, as required by law, and facing censure for rejecting such practices. Yet such practices have serious implications for the ability of all people to access decent healthcare, to live healthy lives, let alone to exercise freedom of mobility. And just as state borders kill, medical borders too can be lethal or enable real harm for people subject to their operation. This can include disregarding migrant autonomy through forced medical procedures, subjecting non-citizens to increased health costs or surveillance, or exposing migrants to risks of premature death. In this way, medical borders can enact a particular necropolitical violence that forces certain racialised populations to live in degrading conditions of ill health at various sites of the confinement continuum, be it in immigration detention, in informal camps, along migrant routes, or marginalised within so-called host communities. Okay, so turning now to Australia's extraterritorial asylum regime, I want to show you how this architecture of healthcare provision evidences the deliberate creation and maintenance of a system that not only produces ill health, but also facilitates the systematic denial of decent healthcare to refugees. As a settler colonial state premised on efforts to dispossess Indigenous sovereignty and peoples, Australia has a long history of racialised exclusion, dating back to at least the quarantine laws of the late 19th century, and enacted most forcefully through the White Australia policy that was officially in operation from 1901 through to 1973. The shift away from a formal policy of White Australia, though, saw the adoption of other techniques of migrant control and exclusion, such as the creation of purpose-built immigration detention centres in the 1970s and the increased political demonisation of unauthorised arrivals through the language of queue jumpers around the same time. So the adoption of Australia's offshore detention regime, first in 2001 and then again in 2012, reflects this longer history of framing non-white migrants who arrive unauthorised by boat as quote-unquote undesirable or deviant. And in practice, Australia has forcibly sent around 4,180 people to PNG and Nauru in a 2-year period, so between 2012 and 2014. There they were detained first for years in rudimentary closed immigration prisons, officially known as regional processing centres or PCs, that were constructed, funded and managed by the Australian government via contractors. If a person was found to be a refugee, they would then be temporarily resettled, sometimes involuntarily, in the Nauru or PNG communities, in the hope of eventual resettlement in third countries. Now, 10 years later, except for around 50 people remaining in PNG in dire circumstances, and a further 15 asylum seekers that Australia transferred to Nauru more recently at the end of last year, all refugees or asylum seekers subject to this regime in the last decade have been either medically evacuated back to Australia or then finally resettled in the US, Canada, or New Zealand. So Australia's spectacle of deterrence is deeply racialised, primarily but not exclusively targeting asylum seekers from Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka and Pakistan. More broadly, it rests upon Australian extractivist neo-colonial histories and configurations of Oceania that treat Pacific Islanders as potential sources of cheap, exploitable migrant labour, and Pacific Islands as spaces for natural resource extraction or refugee expulsion for Australia's benefit. And as my colleague Anthea Vogel has argued in relation to the latter, Australia has sought to rely upon notions of post-colonial Pacific sovereignty in efforts to shield itself from legal and political responsibility, even though UN bodies recognise that Australia exercises what amounts to effective control over refugees there, and the arrangements as a whole, as a matter of international law. So the business of outsourcing and offshoring has been extremely lucrative for transnational capital, creating value in refugee incarceration and externalisation that has resulted in the channeling of private funds into private profit. Regarding healthcare, as I already mentioned, Australia has contracted a for-profit IHMS private operator, a subsidiary of a transnational Singaporean conglomerate that has ties to the US military, in order to provide healthcare services. Successive official Australian inquiries and audit reports have characterised IHMS's provision of healthcare there by its poor medical standards, aggressive profit maximisation, breaches of patient privacy, and fiscal mismanagement. And on the slide, you can see that refugees themselves have identified IHMS as a source of harm and target for protest. So journalist and scholar Behrouz Boochani, across his body of work, including while he was incarcerated in Manus prison, has documented and theorised how IHMS is an integral part in what he calls the systemic torture enacted through refugee externalisation practices. Detailing several cases of medical neglect in Manus prison, he writes of how his fellow refugees experienced their sickness as a form of punishment. And I quote, "Care here is not meant to be easy. People are not supposed to be treated. In Manus prison, pain is there to send you home." So Australia initially too recognised that IHMS and local healthcare options in Nauru and PNG were not adequate on their own, and both bilateral MOUs between Australia and PNG, or Australia and Nauru, included provisions for medical transfers back to Australia where needed. Over time, though, the Australian government sought to severely restrict such transfers on the basis that it had become too difficult, in their words, to return people back to PNG or Nauru following treatment. So by June of 2015, the policy was that medical transfers to Australia should be avoided at all costs and only exercised in or considered in rare cases where a refugee's life was at stake or at risk of serious permanent disability. In practice, refugees with chronic conditions were made to wait for prolonged periods of time or refused transfers outright. So by the end of 2016, UNHCR and others were reporting of alarming levels of mental illness in offshore detention, including endemic self-harm among both adults and children, and recommending urgent action to remove all refugees and asylum seekers to third countries. So turning now to the legal challenges of the Australian detention regime, such challenges have largely seen the use and entrenchment of medical expertise, rationalities and practices in relation to questions of Australia's care and control of refugees. To date, Australian public law and human rights jurisprudence has been largely ineffective to address the harms of offshore detention. A 2016 constitutional law challenge failed on the basis that while Australia was participating in the detention of refugees, Australia was not considered to be the detaining authority, and instead their detention was affected by, in that case, the Nauruan government pursuant to Nauruan law. This meant that since 2016, sustained refugee advocacy has relied upon creative uses of Australian torts law as a site for legal struggle and to create new pathways for compelling the Australian government to transfer refugees back to Australia. So the first such case, which you can see on the slides, was called Plaintiff S99, where a federal court, or the Federal Court of Australia, held that the Australian Minister for Immigration owed a duty to procure a safe and lawful abortion for a refugee woman in Nauru who had been sexually assaulted and who the Australian government had then transferred to PNG for medical treatment without her informed consent. This duty was said to arise from the particular relationship of dependency between the woman and the minister, including the court's recognition that the woman was entirely reliant on the minister to access the procedure she needed. And on the slide, you can see examples of the facts that the court relied upon in order to make that determination. So this case opened the way for the lodgement of around 65 subsequent cases that were premised upon a broader alleged ministerial duty to provide appropriate healthcare to refugees in Nauru and PNG, many of which remain on foot today, either awaiting trial or mediation. Importantly, in all cases, Australian courts either issued interlocutory orders, that is injunctions, compelling the Australian government to transfer refugees back to Australia, or the government agreed to do so voluntarily before any such court order was made. These cases also prompted the introduction of the short-lived and now repealed so-called medevac law that I won't go into today, that provided a legal basis for compelling the Australian Minister for Immigration to transfer sick refugees to Australia in certain circumstances. So taken together, this law reform and emerging jurisprudence created what Miriam Tickton in Casualties of Care called exceptional medical regimes of care, in which state entry or immigration benefits are grounded on a moral imperative to relieve suffering, yet nonetheless exclude the majority of the impoverished people in the world. Tickton shows how, whilst medical expertise purports to represent the truth of the body, the biological is, and I quote, always mediated by the gendered and racialised narratives that allow certain people to be identified as morally legitimate or worthy of being saved, whilst others are not. Tickton argues that although migrants can use their biological bodies as a, and I quote, political device to create the conditions of care in subversive ways, such regimes, she argues, risk, and I again quote, working to displace possibilities for larger forms of collective change, including, I would add, projects of carceral or border abolition. So the Australian court cases attest to how the medicalisation of refugee bodies and suffering functioned as a particular site for state border control or violence. Such processes of medicalisation are rarely smooth and can allow for diagnostic contestation, for instance. So in the legal judgments, courts needed to decide which medical evidence to accept and elevate as reflecting the truth of particular bodies or at particular moments in time. And this was evident in the case of a 30-year-old Somali woman who had requested a pregnancy termination whilst on Nauru. Legal argument in court centred around the nature of the woman's body, in order, and particularly her, the terminology that was used in the case was around her vaginal outlet, in order to determine whether or not she could safely have the medical termination in Taiwan, which was the Australian government's position, or instead in Australia, which was the plaintiff's submission. And so whilst the woman was successful in gaining a court order to compel transfer to Australia, the case relied upon her mobilisation, strategic or otherwise, of her black body as differently marked and culturally specific as a result of what was categorised as FGM, and thus requiring specific medical expertise and treatment that was said to be only available in Australia. And so in this way, the intimate nature of the woman's body became this object of judicial scrutiny and determination upon which immigration rights and outcomes were determined and dependent. And so rather than acknowledging the systematic disempowerment of refugee women within Australia's offshore detention regime, including the way in which the regime curtailed their safety, bodily autonomy, or reproductive freedoms, the case very much frames the potential possible harms of Australia's conduct as arising from the potential inadequate healthcare service delivery. So I realise I'm running out of time, but I will just bring one more example, which is that the medicalisation of refugee bodies also played out in relation to children. And so if you skip ahead to the next slide, this was particularly the case for children with who were diagnosed with so-called resignation syndrome, which carried symptoms of severe social withdrawal, including prolonged food refusal. And this diagnosis recognised or specifically applied to, and I quote, psychologically traumatised children in the midst of a strenuous and lengthy migration process. Yet in these court cases, the Australian government contested this diagnosis. So in one case, the minister submitted evidence from an IHMS doctor that a particular refugee child was not depressed, but instead, and I quote, his threats of self-harm were merely motivated by his desire to be transferred to Australia. In another case, the minister relied on evidence from a IHMS psychiatrist to characterise an adolescent girl's acts of self-harm as, and again I quote, more likely to be a severe reaction to her situation than evidence of her depressive state, even though the minister accepted that she would require rehydration if she continued to deteriorate. And so I think such attempts to downplay the suffering of refugees and the harms of offshore detention and to frame young children as merely seeking to extract some kind of immigration benefit from Australia to which they're not entitled shows how, in Shahram Khosravi's words, certain people are treated as deviant, as eligible for sacrifice, and their bodies become sites of border control. In his words, undesirable people who are now not expelled by the border, but are forced to be the border. But the court's prima facie acceptance of this diagnosis of resignation syndrome, I think also was productive in that it allowed for a more social and political account of refugee suffering that does draw attention to the structural violence of immigration detention. And so in another case, the court actually said that a child's, and I quote, continued residence on Nauru is the causative and contributing factor to his mental illness, and that in order for him to recover, he required, again, I quote, certainty regarding his resettlement and the capacity to build a functional life and to have hope. Okay, so through such findings, I think the cases have reconfigured relations of responsibility and wrongdoing. But they've also relied upon particular constructions of standard of care, which have had some really practical benefits for refugees. So in some cases, it allowed for a claim that that standard of care required refugees to be accompanied by family members or to access medical records or to have culturally specific translators. But I want to argue very briefly that the contestations around standard of care were also racialised in subtle ways. And this was seen in particular in relation to a Queensland coroner's report where he accepted that the relevant standard of care was an Australian one, but then went on to say that the comparable location was a remote clinic in Cape York in Australia. And so whilst the coroner didn't specifically say this, Cape York has the majority of the population in Cape York are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And so research has shown that First Nations people in Australia are more likely to experience adverse health outcomes or premature death due to chronic state underfunding of healthcare facilities in such remote areas, as well as arising from forms of state exposure to state violence and incarceration and institutionalised medical racism. And so I think the fact that the coroner used this as the relevant legal benchmark for determining legal responsibility is particularly illustrative of a settler colonial mentality that accepts and perpetuates differential treatment, including invoking Indigenous health disadvantage to frame the permissible limits around medical care for expelled refugees under Australia's asylum regime. Okay, so to make my final point, I realise I thought I had paired my paperback sufficiently, but I could have done a much better job. But so to make my final point, I think these cases have dominantly been portrayed through a politics of rescue that centres activists, Australian lawyers and doctors for their creative use of torts law. But I think it's politically necessary and empirically accurate to instead centre refugees themselves, without whose instructions or willingness to demand responsibility, these cases could never have been brought. And so I think we need to understand them as acts of refugee claim making and resistance. And I think the cases even provide evidence of this as well, or a partial record of this. So to give just one example, in one case, the court recognised a claimant's documented lack of trust in the healthcare she'd received in Nauru as the basis for compelling transfer to Australia so that she could receive healthcare from professionals she trusted. And this was repeated in other cases as well. That said, the fact that refugees were then transferred back to closed immigration detention in Australia, or then eventually released on cycles of short-term bridging visas meant that refugees publicly expressed a degree of suspicion about this process at times. And I think this is demonstrated by, and I'll end on this note, a quote by the last refugee woman who was medically evacuated from Nauru to Australia in 2020, where she expressed her scepticism about what the transfer would mean for her future. So she said, "I've been locked up now for 7 years. I don't want to go from jail to jail. I need freedom. I have waited on Nauru to be sent elsewhere to be free. Australia would be just another jail for me." So I think the quote illustrates how refugees articulate the confinement continuum of Australia's asylum regime across its offshore and onshore guises, drawing a continuity between their experiences of punishment, exclusion and neglect, and insisting that the harmful impacts of medical borders extend across both guises. I will end it there because I think I have mistimed my paper, but in discussion we can talk about how one of the points that I alluded to at the very start, that in order to move beyond an understanding of refugee justice in the Australian context, I think we need to connect that with anti-colonial visions of Oceania that have long histories and that prioritise freedom and mobility without discrimination in the region, but that are also attentive to articulations of Indigenous sovereignty that so that migration as decolonisation or migration of reparations for past colonial harms doesn't become another form of intensification of Indigenous dispossession either. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sara, for such a rich and yeah, very interesting intervention. I'm going to pass the floor now to Monish. He's a specialist on race, state violence, and border processes. So I'm looking forward to his comments also from the perspective of sociology and criminology, which I think are going to be very complementary to your insights. We are going to have to try to cut back a little bit on the time previously foreseen. So if Monish, you can perhaps use up to 12 minutes, if that's all right, so that then we can open up for questions and debate.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Sara. I think, in my opinion, this is a stunning piece of work. What appears striking to me is that healthcare and medicine have always been central to the bordering practices, right? And they have huge implications for reproductive justice, and probably your work will end up informing reproductive justice activism and debates in the Australian context. So, medical borders have always been there and always also been in front of us. The lethal form of racial control and reproductive control. Even in the UK context, for instance, we always talk about suicides and self-harm in detention. And actually, one of the government's official report, short report, for instance, highlighted that each month, about 30 people are on suicide watch. And their health is so bad that they cannot and must not be held in confinement and rather offered urgent medical attention and release, but yet they're held there for months and months. And even within my own work, I think I've documented numerous cases which are point blank shocking. The Iranian man who had a small tiny mole, and he flagged that up to the detention doctors, and all they did was give him paracetamol after paracetamol after paracetamol. There was no end to how many paracetamols he had throughout his time. And then the mole started growing and growing, and one day he just simply fainted. And then they were like, okay, he might as well need secondary or tertiary care, so let's just take him to the hospital. And that was a cancerous mole, so he was half mutilated. And even at the hospital, the immigration officials were like, when can we take him back? And doctors like, no, you cannot take him back, leave him alone, right? Eventually he got refugee status, but at what cost, right? Again, attended to a woman ages ago who was trapped in the cycle of repeated detention. So she would be released from detention, PTSD, approach a survivor, where they'll try and stabilize her health, because all you can do is stabilize their health because it's still going through, the asylum system. They have to live through it somehow. And the minute they feel that they're making some progress, things are being stable, she would be redetained. And there's something to do with corporate arrangements, how people keep on going back and get stuck in the repeated cycle of detention. And each time she went in, she would like self-harm, she would attempt suicide, she'll go out, she'll be even worse, and they'll try and stabilize her. So it was like a repeated cycle for the practitioners outside, but also it kind of showed the neglect of the system, but also neglect of the medical system inside detention centers, right? There were cases where people were put into vegetative state, where they were over-medicated to a point that they were not able to work with the lawyers on their immigration and asylum cases. So I think the list goes on with torture survivors and how they are assessed in detention centers. In some cases, the nurses and doctors, they both sign off the fit to detain and fit to deport forms. Nurses sign off fit to deport forms in blatant cases where people are actually not fit to fly. There was a case of Albanian woman, heavily pregnant, bleeding. All they did was they gave her sanitary pads and put her on the flight. A man with stitches in his cornea, the nurse signs off, he's fit to be deported. You can use minimal use of force. So even the use of force was sanctioned by the medical authorities. And actually, our former Prime Minister David Cameron. I don't even know how many formers they've changed so many times over, right? Scandalous government. They keep money aside he was keeping money aside for unlawful detention lawsuits. So actually they create a budget pool because they know it's coming and they're fine with it because they just simply see this as a collateral damage of their system or a deliberate damage of the system and they have to attend to it, right? So I think, and outside of detention as well, I think medicine has been used, for surveillance purposes. People have gone through skin biopsies and their DNA has been run through the DNA database. The data has then been used in live asylum cases because that DNA shows which part of the world they come from. If that does not correlate to the asylum interview, then, they were subjected to rejection. Although that practice was stopped after huge scientific backlash, but it was still used, right? So what I'm getting at is that medicine is it appears in work of so many critical scholars in so many different ways. It's all dispersed all over. And I somehow feel that we all are hungry to find a unified framework or conceptual hook to understand, illuminate, unpack, and challenge, analyze these practices. And I think your analysis of medical borders or your concept of medical borders just gives us just that. And I think that's what we need to start directing our attention to and to uncover racialized forms of state violence. Although I do have a question. Is it appropriate to ask a question?
Please.
Yes. Okay. So how do you think medical borders can be rejected? I'm going beyond resistance because I think I've had the resistance discourse because I think state creates a room for resistance. So I feel sometimes that resistance is given to us by the state. So I think I want to move beyond that and say, how can we reject it? And how can then we challenge? But we can come back to it later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Manish. That was very much on time, actually. We are sparing, I think, another 5 minutes, but thanks a lot for keeping to the time. I'm going to pass the floor to Dr. Nicolette Busuttil. As I already mentioned before, she's a specialist in the rights of persons with disabilities who are refugees or other categories of migrants, and in particularly the European context. And I'm sure she can offer very valuable comments on Sara's input and provide further contextualization and food for thought in this regard. And then I'm going to give the floor to Sara in case she has quick reactions on the comments received before opening for general discussion. So Nicolette, the floor is yours. And again, 10, 12 minutes, that would be ideal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Violetta. And thank you very much, Sara, for a richly woven tapestry, I think, on the myriad ways in which the medical border, the medical assemblage, as you call it, is implicated in the infliction of suffering. And while your analysis is, of course, drawn from the Australian example, I found it very striking, indeed very sad, just how many similarities it bears to other contexts globally. This morning, our Home Secretary was tweeting about how, oh, another target achieved because now we have even more stringent family migration rules. And I read that as I was rereading your paper, and for me, it encapsulates one of the 3 points that I want to make in response to your work, which is it really shows how suffering is the point, right? And the suffering is intentional, and it is the suffering as deterrence, and it is, I would argue, disablement as deterrence. It is the disablement that is produced as a result of the whole system being in place. But before that, thank you, because in your paper, and in your presentation, I was really struck by how you center the individuals at the heart of it all, and the emphasis on the human being, the emphasis on the implications for the human being, but also I think in your choice of literature to focus or to draw upon where available those who have lived through the experience themselves, whether it is Behrouz Bouchani, but also in terms of drawing upon the voices of politicians in Oceania to kind of counter the usual narrative of, oh, these are the lawyers. As you yourself mentioned at one point in your paper, oh, this is the narrative with the lawyers being seen as the saviors in response to this awful situation. So suffering as being the point. I was reminded very much of Alicia Ali Yamin's work, who in advocating for a human rights-based approach to health recalls, just like you do, the complex interlocking structures and frameworks that coalesce to produce suffering. And as she says, while it is true that the decrement in life, quality of life, the decrement in health does arise because of genetics, because of poor life choices, because of bad luck, really, we cannot overlook how it is structural structures and oppression that actually, the imbalances that create suffering in the illness. And your work definitely, as also to draw upon what Monish has said, has shown just how these operate in the Australian context, but as I agree, applicable way beyond that. But it's all held together by a simple, if not simplistic logic. And that is, as I mentioned, suffering as being the point. And in fact, in your conclusion, you say, well, the logic of economic efficiency doesn't work. That is definitely not the case. The logic of austerity and austerity politics, not the case. So then what is left? And this is the imposition, the disabling of individuals as intentional. And for me, that is important because it reminds me very much of the discourse around disability and the revolution that has come, or the evolution, if you want, in the understanding of disability human rights, right? And the idea that where disability oppression was very much and continues to be centered in the medical model of disability and in this medicalized understanding where power and control is vested in medical and health professionals instead of being vested in the individuals themselves who are affected by it. And in your work, I was reminded, you mentioned that this is part of a historical continuum of exclusion and the violence and settler colonial violence and all of that. But I would say also the ableism of it all, right? You mentioned at one point Australia and the racial hygiene laws in other countries and so on. But we also cannot forget that Australia is one of the states that continues to maintain a health requirement in general for visas. I know it's under review at the moment, but if they do the same thing that they did in 2010, which was commission a review and then forget about it, then it's, for me, it's just something to think about there. And maybe it feeds into that continuum that you speak of. But also, when you refer to the role that is played by medical professionals, I think it's also important to draw upon what you say, Monish, the long history of healthcare professionals or healthcare adjacent professionals who are implicated in the oppression and extermination of oppressed groups. And I mean, it's, we can't forget that before Nazi Germany started mandating the forced sterilization of individuals with healthcare conditions with mental illness, in the sunset of the Weimar Republic, physicians were enabled to do this, and they decided to take it on with lots of vigor. And we have, yes, the Soviet psychiatry, we have all the memory of when psychiatry in particular is used to exert control over others. But it's also worth, I would say, keeping in mind the recent understanding that even in the everyday transactions, in the everyday encounters between physician and individual, when we are speaking of individuals with disabilities, that I would argue the population you speak of become as a result of government policy, there is that imbalance of power which has been used to violate rights and deprive the individual of their autonomy. And in looking then at this medical border, I know that your argument is, at one point you say, well, Australian law doesn't recognize a legal cause of action under international law, and they might sign up to the Refugee Convention, ICASCAR, etc. But potentially the CRPD does at something a little bit different, the Disability Rights Convention. Yes, it's true, Australia has a reservation, right, to the CRPD, particularly when it comes to issues of migration. But where I find the CRPD particularly powerful is in its acknowledgement of the obligation to produce healthcare to people specifically because of their disability, and its framing of the state as being responsible for dismantling the barriers that preclude the enjoyment of rights. And in this case, you very starkly show us how it is the state that is producing disablement, how it is the state that is creating a structure purposely, right, to deprive individual of their rights, whether it's the right to protection, but also their very basic right to dignity, to live a life somehow where your basic needs are met. And that comes out very much when you speak of the resignation syndrome. And the court's treatment of it. And at one point when you said it's a welcome acknowledgement of the socio-political reality, where the court, instead of accepting the argument, this is a medical disease, right? And so this person needs medical treatment in the form of whatever pharmacological response and so on. No, this is actually a response to the situation that the person is in. And in fact, it's laughable, but ultimately very sad to hear of the professionals' presentation of this as this is, whether it's a child or an adult, but the fact that you present that as a way for the individual to get immigration benefit, my response would be, so what? It doesn't make it any less real, right? It doesn't make the harm that the individual is going through any less real. It might, yes, be, it might make the individual less acceptable politically or to the, you know, from, if we're thinking in terms of moralistic argument, but why is that? And that is where I think then that the ableism of it and the fear of individuals with mental health care issues then can feed into it and can come into play. Because what upon reading your work and listening to you talk, we have a situation where the state is disabling individuals, is rendering individuals unwell, and then not only disavowing any of its responsibilities to provide treatment, but fashioning them into individuals who somehow deserve it less. And I will conclude with this. So, yes, Violeta, where? You mentioned the standard of care, right? And whose standard of care matters. And that even there, we see once again the secular colonial violence element of it, because the comparator, as you say, is, oh, this is somehow the individual who is presented as the least deserving, right? So we are not looking at the quality of care that we expect probably for the government and the cabinet, but we are looking at the people who are traditionally excluded and oppressed. And that to me reminded me very much of the European Court of Human Rights and the treatment of the cases that involve the denial of healthcare in countries of return, where the court says, well, this is a naturally occurring illness. I mean, this is not a naturally occurring illness, in as much if I spend my day in bed and then I can't get up because I'm you know, I haven't done any exercise as natural as that. But also where the court will define and construct what qualifies as serious harm differently according to whether that that is going to be experienced on the territory or in the country of return. And for me, the parallels were very stark. And a reminder that, after all, as you mentioned, all of these struggles are very much connected, and that what has been, and something that must continue to be resisted or rejected, to end on your point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nicolette. I think both lines of comments are very complementary and do serve to highlight key aspects of the paper and the contribution that Sara is making to the broader debate. So I'd like to give Sara the floor now for responses, impressions on the comments that you have received and to kickstart the conversation. And then I encourage people, both in the room and in the chat, to start thinking about their questions so that then we can take it from there and open up to the wider general discussion. So Sara, please.
So let me firstly say thank you so much for those rich and generous comments. There's so many threads that I wish I could take up and respond to. Perhaps we can do it after the seminar as well, or in the subsequent discussion. On the concept of the medical border, I certainly don't want to claim any credit for the concept. You know, I tried to gesture to how it has emerged in a lot of the historical scholarship on colonial immigration controls. But I do think that we have this rich literature in border studies that has theorized different border assemblages, such as the digital border, the biopolitical border or the necropolitical border. And I do feel that the idea of the medical border has not perhaps received the attention in that particular conversation that it deserves, or that I think. And so I do hope that the contribution of this project is to pay attention to that concept in this particular context. Monish, the examples you brought were just so harrowing, and it reminds me also in the Australian context how ideas of vulnerability get mobilised or used in order to detain people again. So there's examples of refugee women who have been transferred from offshore detention, and they're the ones that remain in closed detention for the longest period of time, sometimes on the basis that they're too vulnerable. And so it's these medical assessments, or that they're too much at risk, as you said, on suicide watch. So it becomes the basis then for perpetuating the very harm that has basically made them vulnerable. And also in relation to what you were saying about the man with the cancer on his cheek, it reminds me there's a current inquest in Australia at the moment in relation to a man who died in Manus prison. The inquest is to determine in part the cause of death, but it appears that he had a brain aneurysm and collapsed and then fell down a flight of stairs and suffered catastrophic head injury such that he passed away. And the hearing's ongoing at the moment, and they heard evidence that he had presented himself 60 times to the IHMS clinic in the lead up to that incident. And they had done some tests, right, but kept sending him away. And he wrote letters to the government, to caseworkers, fellow refugees also wrote letters on his behalf because they were witnessing his deterioration. And it just attests to the cultures of disbelief or suspicion, and the way in which healthcare provision becomes, enrolled in these cultures of deterrence and externalisation. So, refugee law scholars have written about cultures of disbelief and suspicion within RSD, and I think we can really see them playing out in this context as well. Nicolette, thank you for your comments around particularly sort of foregrounding the way in which the infliction of suffering is deliberate. So one thing that I didn't have time to go into is that this is Australia's second introduction of the offshore detention. So in the first phase of offshore detention from 2001 to 2007, it had a slightly different model. So refugee status determination was run by the UNHCR, and medical provision was provided by an MSF. But they became really outraged with the harm that they saw being inflicted on refugees under that regime, and became quite vocal critics. And so I think it's really telling that this time round, Australia has instead contracted a for-profit service provider to provide healthcare. And I didn't have time to go into the way in which that then plays out. Yes, there have been whistleblower doctors who have worked for IHMS, who have received some public attention, and also released some correspondence that they've had with IHMS management that has shown that, IHMS expresses concern that, medical requests are just ignored by Border Force, or but IHMS sees themselves in this difficult position and tries to project responsibility onto Border Force instead. But these doctors, then their contracts don't get renewed, or they don't get visas to return to Nauru. And so there's so many stages in which this, there is this, as you said, this knowing creation of a regime that inflicts suffering, which makes it that puts pressure on doctors to conform to that culture of deterrence. And thank you also so much for mentioning the Convention on the Rights of People with Disability. I really don't know that convention well. So in the Australian context, people have brought individual communications under the ICCPR in relation to the right to be free from torture. Australia has not signed the optional protocol of the Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And so that's not an avenue for, I guess, political, for legal mobilisation. But people have tried to use the Convention on the Elimination of Gender Discrimination and also the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination as points of intervention, also for individual communications. But I don't know of anyone who's used the Convention on the Rights of People with Disability. And particularly, I found in writing this paper that I was turning to some of the critical disability studies scholarship as well, and found that the most useful for trying to understand, as you said, the processes of the deliberate process of deterioration, deteriorization. Or so that was really useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the three of you. I wonder whether there are questions in the room. The chat is warming up. I mean, I would have questions of my own, so I wonder whether I should just kickstart the discussion and then let others intervene. I cannot really see the room, so I wonder whether there are any hands up. If not yet, then Sara did have a number of questions that really tally with the comments and some of your responses. And so I guess, I mean, one characterization of the infliction of suffering, whether as deterrence or punishment. I mean, if this is really the point of the policy in the form of withdrawing or curtailing or reducing adequate medical care and medical attention, doesn't this amount per se and without more to ill treatment? And would any of your critique then be sharpened if this is actually the case? Or is it sufficient for you to build up your critique that this be characterized as a form of necropolitical or biopolitical control? I mean, is there a nuance? I mean, is there an edge that the characterization of this as ill treatment would add to the critique? Would it be, I don't know, sharpened or more clear or more incisive in some way? Then I was wondering, I mean, for those that are not familiar with the Australian system and maybe not broadly with law itself, I mean, I was wondering, why was tort law mobilized in this case rather than other forms of remedies and potential legal avenues? I mean, what is the strategic advantage, particularly considering the very salience of human rights in all of the different examples that you have provided, I mean, be it in the form of children's rights or women's rights or the rights of people with disabilities, why was there a choice for tort law instead of human rights avenues? Yeah, and I think I'll leave it at that. I see that there are some perhaps other persons who might want to intervene. So yeah, if you would like to start with those while people warm up.
Yeah, great, thank you. So I'll start with your second question or point first. So why torts law rather than other legal avenues around, say, human rights? I mean, Australia has a fairly, it's very difficult to find a legal action on the basis of human rights law in Australia. So we do have some constitutionally implied human rights, but they're not necessarily helpful in this situation. We don't have a federal sort of Bill of Rights, for example, although there was some debate around or push for that at some point. Some states do, in states jurisdictions do have bills of rights, but they have, I think they have been used in relation to people in onshore immigration detention, but they don't really have much, I think, legal teeth. That's my understanding. And people have tried to bring cases before the courts based on international instruments that Australia has ratified, but the courts have said that that doesn't give you a cause of action in the Australian domestic context. So Australia really kind of, scholars like Hilary Charlesworth and others have said that Australia has a sort of a paranoid approach to international law in that it, in that it's willing to sign on to certain conventions, but not really giving, creating infrastructure to allow for their enforcement. In relation to the second question, so whether, so if I understood your question correctly, was it that focusing more on the punishment side of this policy, whether that would give it more analytical teeth or? Yeah, I agree. And I think that's what's so powerful about Feroz Bouchani's work and the reporting and the scholarship that he's done in this area, because he does insist on IHMS, the lack of care in healthcare provision and the creation of these infrastructures that sort of that make it deliberately difficult for people to receive decent care. And even when there's processes in place, such as the Medivac procedure, in some of the cases you can see that there's, so even when a request for medical transfer is made, the first thing that Border Force will do is query that request and will ask for more information, which sounds also very legitimate, you know, on the face of it, but it's a delay tactic and it's a way of trying to create lots of building blocks in order to actually make transfers happen. And from the whistleblower doctors have said that they would submit requests and just nothing would happen as well. So it's I think it's a knowing maintenance of a system where that is the norm. So some coroners have, or of the two coronial inquests we've had, they have both requested or recommended, sorry, rather, review of these systems and better implementation of the system, but of course, nothing happens. But yeah, also when Australia set up offshore detention the second time, they were very clear that it was intended to keep certain refugees for prolonged periods in offshore detention as a deterrent. They didn't use the language of punishment, but as a deterrent, so that they would so that refugees elsewhere, some abstract, unnamed group of refugees elsewhere, would not come to Australia on the basis of seeing and knowing how terrible it was in offshore detention. And some of the publicity campaigns, so I included the storyboard that the Australian government created, directly try to mobilise diaspora refugee communities in Australia in order so that they tell their family overseas about how bad things are in Australia as well. So I do think, yeah, your question around whether sort of framing it around punishment instead, whether that would sharpen the critique, I think that's really useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, for me, the thing is to characterize this as punishment. I don't really think that intentions would count. I mean, I think we should be looking for the effects and what this does to people, and contextualize it in terms of subjective and objective factors, and then considering, you know, age or any vulnerability indicators that would make the treatment punishment. I don't think will depend on whether the state intended or not to inflict.
Sure. Okay. Sorry, I misunderstood your question.
No, but you see what I mean? I mean, I think if this can be characterized as punishment, probably.
So, I mean, it's an interesting question because one of the reasons why Australia has been able to maintain a system of indefinite detention up until pretty much last year has been because the High Court has framed indefinite detention as administrative rather than punitive. And it's only in the last year that they've been willing to sort of reconsider that and put some limits around around the length of immigration detention. So now, yeah, I mean, I don't want to go into the doctrinal test for it now, but I think that is, I think in the Australian context, one of the reasons why we have tried to frame it so much as punishment is because of that, that High Court jurisprudence as well.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions that people would like to formulate?
Yeah,
so there is a hand in the room.
But I will. Thanks so much for your paper, Sarah. I thought the point that you made around the standard of care being at Cape York is a very important one and very interesting. And I was wondering how that was justified, like how the judge, I can't remember tort law, and it's like this, it's sort of interesting to me that tort law is being used here. I mean, it is, of course, there's not a national human rights framework in Australia, but it's also just the kind of general failure of public law to provide an adequate, you know, source of protection for refugees, as of course it's failed for Indigenous people as well. And there's something interesting, I think, because I was just, when I saw in the abstract for your paper, you're looking at tort law, I also thought about, there was also a high profile Australian case of a young Australian woman using tort law to bring an action against a minister in regards to climate change, right?
Yeah, the Sharma decision.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's something, I think there's something interesting there in regards to the kind of resort to private law in the wake of a total lack of protection from public law, which is where I think we turn to for that kind of thing. And, you know, if you're a social justice oriented law student, you wouldn't really go into tort law, you know, and so there's kind of interesting creative uses of tort law. But then it's interesting that here it's at the level of deciding which standard of care to use, and I can't remember how that's decided, that then the kind of public racial formation of the state comes back in, right? Even when we the law pars it down to the private law question of how individuals treat each other, that formation then comes back in through the invocation of place and a very racialized place. So yeah, I was wondering if you could tell us how that was justified.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so it was actually the coroner's report rather than one of the court cases. So it was a really passing reference, but it was justified on the basis of things that were just kind of accepted. So the fact that Manus is considered, or Nauru were considered remote to Australia, right? And that we need to accept that there's operational difficulties in resourcing certain healthcare facilities, but it doesn't, so I guess in framing it in that way, it doesn't take, I mean, to make some obvious points, but, you know, Australia's colonial history in PNG and Nauru into consideration, the fact that the reason the Nauru hospital that I started the paper off with is under-resourced and underfunding is connected to Australian extractivism, and also, yeah, Australian mining in PNG as well. Yeah, so I think it was a kind of, I think, passing remark that, and I'd be actually interested to go back to perhaps the transcripts from the, and I haven't done that, from the coroner's inquest to see to what degree that was contested.
Yeah.
But it was kind of just a passing reference, but I was really interested in that. But I think the resort to private law is, yeah, also really interesting in this space and in other spaces. But I think what we'll see play out in relation to the cases that I looked at, we do have judgments in relation to the orders that the court made, but because they're injunctive relief and because to a degree they achieve the political purpose that refugees wanted to achieve, which is to be transferred from situations of harm, even though many were then transferred into other situations of harm, I'm not sure the cases will actually run to trial. And so we've seen that the first case has now been settled, and it seems like the Australian government may be trying to settle cases so that we don't actually have precedent, right? But I think nonetheless that they have set a precedent around what you can get from injunctive relief. So even that is really useful. Or if it does go to trial, maybe we will get a strong finding around duty of care, but it might not necessarily be a positive outcome for the particular plaintiff. In the sense that there'll be so many, I mean, even with the plaintiff S99, Australia contested everything. They contested what the applicable law was. They were saying it should be Nauru law or PNG law rather than Australian law. And it was only because the plaintiff was able to successfully argue that the act of tort was the minister's decision to procure healthcare, to send her to PNG, to all these things that happened in Australia, that they were able to say that it actually is Australian torts law that should apply. But that was different too, because there was another torts case in the Victorian Supreme Court, so again, Australia, in relation to harm that people suffered in Manus Prison. And in that case, my understanding is it was PNG law that applied because the act of harm was in PNG. But that case didn't run to trial. So it settled, the government settled the day before the trial was supposed to start. But that was Australia's, to date, largest human right settlement. I think it's $70 million or something, which was divided amongst a lot of people. But you can see this pattern that, as you said, the Australian government doesn't want to set precedent around these cases because they have implication for other cases in other areas as well, not just refugee justice.
Thank you. So we have a question. Oh, yeah, sorry, there's also a question from the chat on the online Zoom. Shall we take the question from the room and then the one from the Zoom chat? Perhaps we can group them. I mean, considering also the time that we have left. Shall we do that?
Sure.
So
I'll be
from the room
really
first.
quick. So I just want to complicate the understanding of medical borders. Right? So as you were speaking, I was thinking about repatriative medical care, where the focus of medicine is not actually on treatment and elevating the suffering of people, removing people from suffering or treating their suffering, whichever way you want to put it. But the idea is to keep them actually in a barely survival state so that they are then deported. So the focus is so intense on deportation. We're talking about punishment, deterrence, but actually there is something about deportation in itself that the idea is to get rid of them as quickly as possible. So what's the whole point of giving them full treatment? Because the entire focus is on removal. So I'm just wondering whether you've thought about repatriating medicine in that way. Because repatriative medicine means something totally different, but I think in this context it might mean something else.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question.
Sorry, Sarah, just if you don't mind, let's collect the questions because I'm a bit worried that otherwise you're not going to be able to hear all of them. So I give the floor to Team Malone, who will be speaking from Zoom.
Thanks, thanks, Valisa. Great talk, great discussion. it's yeah. I mean, it's really sad, and to hear about this. But I've heard a lot of it before, and as you say, countries emulate each other in what they're trying to do. Is there any? I think we need to be imaginative in solutions to this, and I think we need to work together. I mean, we need to work. I'm a medic, but I work in the university, teaching medical students about migration. Medical profession needs to work with migration lawyers and people who study, refugees and people on the move. And we need to come up with imaginative solutions. And in the UK, we were, there are other bodies. You never get anywhere with the border force or anything like that. You never get anywhere with these government bodies, but there are these pseudo-government bodies, the regulators of the doctors, the regulators, the royal colleges that regulate the nurses, the UK, the Care Quality Commission, that regulate, the way care is delivered on if it's on British soil. Are there equivalent organisations in Australia where that can be done? And can some of these horrendous stories be elevated to UN level, to the WHO, to try and get international standards for what is and is not acceptable? Organisations like IHMS may find themselves blacklisted by some of the medical regulators, or whatever. They can't actually employ, or the doctors or the nurses or whatever who work for them maybe will lose their license to practice. Any thoughts on how that whether there's a way to take that approach?
Thank you, Tim. I wonder whether there's maybe a final question from the room that then Sara can address jointly with those that have already been formulated. Ellen?
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. And the concept of medical borders and the work that you're writing on is super fascinating. And I see a lot of it applied into my work on the Greek hotspots. And granted, it's slightly different because obviously you're working within the Greek and EU jurisdiction, but you still see similar things kind of replicating themselves. What is slightly different is I think there's also a problem on the islands of the simultaneous existence of state medical officials and NGO medical officials, and that there's politics going on between that, and that issues arising from those two things happening simultaneously, and the Greek authorities saying that only the state doctors have the legal authority for certain things and certain activities, and that creates a tension itself. But the question that I kind of wanted to direct to the room, and also to Mona, I'd really like to hear what your thoughts are on this, and on the supposed neutrality of medical professionals and the tensions that are emerging, with also a second layer of distrust and suspicion that people have towards medical professionals and the impact that has. So it's not just a matter of the medical professionals themselves having that disbelief and distrust towards people, but that people develop that distrust and disbelief that they're going to get any medical assistance or care. And how that then also ends up playing into the asylum determination procedures, bringing forward claims of violence against police or other medical professionals in that space, and how there's just this cycle that ends up replicating itself.
Thank you, Ellen. Give back the floor to Sara for our response in the time remaining. We don't have a lot, but it would be great if you could address each of the
I'll try and be brief. But thank you for those three great questions. Very briefly, in relation to the question of medical licensing, actually, it was so at one point it became public knowledge that IHMS didn't have a local license to practice in PNG, and so they actually were practicing without a license, and so as a result, the Australian government, I think, was compelled to end its contract with IHMS at a particular time and then engage a different company, particularly just for PNG, but not for Nauru. But yeah, I think people have been trying to push the medical regulators to perhaps have a more sort of interventionist approach in relation to offshore detention. To date, I haven't sort of seen any sort of public outcome around that. But yeah, it's certainly an interesting side of, I guess, intervention. In relation to the tension between different doctors in these contexts, in the context of offshore detention, it was really interesting that so both Nauru and Australia tried to limit whether or not refugees in offshore detention were entitled to telehealth and specifically consultation with Australian doctors. And Australia tried to, in the Medivac laws that I didn't go into, stipulate, at one point tried to make that more difficult, but that was unsuccessful. But you can, these tensions are really, I think, important to pay attention to. They have huge implications for whether people or not can access medical care, and then also, as you said, the legal outcomes that that flow from that as well. And Monish, yeah, great point. Let's keep talking about. And I realised I never answered your question around how do we reject medical borders, which I don't think I can do in the current given that we're over time. But I think it has to be part of broader critiques and politics and mobilisations around borders more generally, rather than the medical border in isolation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for very insightful responses. Thank you all very much for an excellent discussion. Virtual applause on my regard. Yeah, thank you, Sara, for coming all the way from Australia to present this important research to us that will keep us going and reflecting upon transplants and different ways in which policies travel across the globe to replicate deterrence mechanisms and mechanisms of suffering and biopolitical control that we see on both sides of the divide. I just wanted to say, for those that might not have been able to join from the beginning, particularly some of those who joined us online, the talk has been recorded and will be available in a couple of days on the YouTube playlist of the Borders Centre. So watch this space, it will be available soon. And thank you all very much for a very rich and interesting conversation. Thank you.